She froze. The moment my eyes met hers in that restaurant, amid the false glow of the wine glasses and the embarrassed laugh escaping the lips of the man sitting across from her, time stood still. I didn't say anything right away. I just walked toward the table, with a calm that made no sense given the fire raging in my chest. When I stopped beside them, I looked directly into her eyes, those same eyes that had so often told me, "I love you," in the morning, and blurted out, "You weren't going to tell me anything, were you? It's a shame I found out this way." She tried to laugh. A nervous, empty laugh that died before it could even fully form. She mumbled some excuse, saying it was a work lunch, that I was overreacting, that I didn't understand. And I just stared at her silently, like someone watching an entire story collapse in a single scene. I knew. I knew even before I got there. Something inside me no longer believed the excuses, the excused absences, the lukewarm hugs and automatic kisses. But seeing with my own eyes is different. It's when betrayal ceases to be suspicion and becomes presence. The presence of another in the place you should be. The presence of a man smiling at the woman who, until yesterday, said she only had eyes for me. The presence of a new world where you are the stranger, the outcast, the discarded. And that's what I felt, as if I had been removed from the equation of my own life, replaced unceremoniously by someone who didn't even know what it was like to love her when she cried in the middle of the night. I returned home with my head spinning. A mixture of disbelief and pain followed me like a ghost. I waited. I sat on the living room couch, the same one where we'd laughed so often, planned trips, dreamed of having children. And I waited. When the door finally opened and she came in, I said directly, "I know everything. And I'm leaving." There was no scandal. There were no tears in that moment. She simply lowered her head and said she understood. That I should do what I needed to do. That maybe this was for the best. In that moment, the emptiness hurt more than the betrayal. It hurt that she'd let me go so easily, as if our love had turned to dust. But time is strange. It corrodes, but it also reveals. The days passed, and the silence began to speak louder. She didn't seek me out immediately, but when she did, it was too late. I had moved on. I had rebuilt what was left of me. I reinvented myself with the pain she left me. Because the kind of betrayal she committed isn't just physical, it made me doubt my worth, my intuition, my own life. And there's nothing crueler than distrusting your own feelings. She came to me with a trembling voice, red eyes, saying she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. That the other man wasn't who she thought he was. That he disappeared when she needed him most. That no one else looked at her the way I did. That no conversation was like ours. No touch like mine. That she even missed my silence. She said she loved me. That she regretted it the instant after I said goodbye. That she'd do anything to have one more day by my side. But I was no longer the same man. The love I once had turned into self-respect. The pain I carried became the certainty that I deserved better. And I found it. I found peace in the arms of someone who looked at me like she hadn't in years. Who listened to my story with empathy, not haste. Who tended to my wounds without asking why they were there. And while I rebuilt my life with firm steps, she sank into absence. She tried to move on, pursued new relationships, tried to fill the void with memories. But the truth is, there's no substitute for true love. And what she lost, she realized too late. She tried to win me back as if no time had passed, as if what she did hadn't left scars. But betrayal isn't just a mistake. It's a choice. A choice that changes everything. That turns pages without warning. That destroys trust that took years to build. She lives today with the weight of regret. She lives surrounded by memories that no longer fit with reality. Because the worst loneliness isn't being alone, it's remembering what you had and knowing you'll never have it again. I moved on. And she stayed. And when he saw me one day, truly smiling, holding hands with someone who loved me right, he had no words. Only silence. The same silence she used when I told him I was leaving. Only this time, her silence was filled with tears. But what drives someone to destroy everything they've built? Why would someone trade security for novelty, love for illusion, truth for desire? What was she looking for that I no longer gave her? What was behind that lunch that broke up a marriage? How did she react when she discovered she wasn't loved back? And did she know, deep down, that she was losing the man of her life the very moment she smiled at someone else? Maybe the answer lies in that day. In that restaurant. In the moment she froze. Because in that second, perhaps, she knew, that what she was losing would never come back. But would fate make her pay for it in kind? Or would the greatest punishment be precisely that, seeing me happy, with someone else? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but based on situations realistic and emotional. The objective is clear, to show how betrayal destroys homes, hearts and trusts, leaving deep scars. Now, take a deep breath. Because you're about to hear a shocking story, which will stir your emotions from beginning to end. Get ready. They met on an ordinary day, in the simplest way chance could provide, and yet, from the first moment, there was something different between them. Daniel was a calm-spoken man with a direct gaze, the kind that conveys confidence without raising his voice. He had worked for over a decade as a financial analyst at a mid-sized company and had a predictable, methodical routine, almost boring to outsiders, but for him, it was synonymous with stability. He found pleasure in the little things, the smell of coffee in the morning, the hardcover books lined up on the bookshelf, the instrumental music playing softly as he organized spreadsheets, and the silence of Sunday nights with the one he loved. Laura, on the other hand, was all about movement. A graphic design professor at a local university, she lived intensely every second of the day. She was sensitive, creative, and restless. She loved bold colors, impromptu midweek parties, cafes with complicated names, and moving furniture around whenever the world felt too still. Her eyes seemed to dance when she talked about something she loved, and her hands always moved as she explained an idea or memory. She had a loud, spontaneous laugh that seemed to light up any room she entered. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, Daniel and Laura complemented each other in an almost poetic way. He anchored her, she lifted him. He calmed her, she awakened him. It was as if, together, they had found the balance between serenity and passion. They married after 2 years of intense courtship, filled with late-night conversations, weekend trips, and notes hidden in pockets. They built a house with large windows, a lavender garden, and a custom-designed bookcase that encompassed the entire living room, with plenty of room for his books and her paintings. The first years of their marriage were smooth sailing. Daniel always had an almost religious dedication to his commitment. He woke up early to make coffee on her class day, bought flowers without a set date, and made a point of hearing about his students, their projects, and the sketches that never got finished. Laura, in turn, lovingly cultivated her husband's sensitive side. She sent sweet texts in the middle of the afternoon, insisted he leave the office and go watch the sunset with her in the park, and on cold nights, she liked to cuddle up against his chest, telling him that was where she felt safe. They had rituals, silly secrets between them, words only they understood. A world within a world. Over time, as happens to all couples facing real life, came the tight schedules, bills to pay, and the fatigue of the dragging days. But even in the most monotonous moments, there was a solid respect between them, a silent care that sustained their relationship. Dinners for two became less frequent, but there were still smiles at breakfast. Travel gave way to TV marathons on the couch, but their eyes still sought each other amidst the hustle and bustle. Laura, with her natural restlessness, began seeking new projects, new ideas, new challenges. She was invited to organize an artistic event at the university and dove into the work with the enthusiasm she always had for all things creative. Daniel supported her as best he could, even when he didn't fully understand the hectic world she was in. He knew that creative freedom was essential to her, and so he avoided any pressure. He was always there, discreet but present, like a steady anchor amidst the unstable tide that was his wife's world. On weekends, while she drew or wrote proposals, he tended the garden, organized documents, or prepared a special lunch. They shared a relationship of respect and admiration, even if at times the connection seemed quieter than before. It wasn't an explosive love, but a deep, mature one, forged through daily life and the choices made for love, even when enthusiasm gave way to routine. Mutual friends saw them as an example of a balanced couple. Those going through crises sought their advice. Those just starting out in relationships looked to them as a model of how love could solidify over time. There was a rare sweetness in Daniel's gaze toward Laura, a kind of affection that wasn't shouted, but felt in the way he listened to her every word, even when she lost herself in technical design details he didn't understand. There was a caress in Laura's hands on his shoulders that seemed to say, "You support me without imprisoning me." That fall marked the 8th anniversary of their marriage. It was a simple affair, with no party or grand plans. Daniel chose to book a restaurant where they had dined together for the first time, while Laura prepared a special gift, a handmade notebook with collages of memories between the two, old notes, movie tickets, and a handwritten poem. The evening was light, with sincere laughter, memories rekindled, and promises made without needing to be spoken aloud. It seemed like they were doing well, there were no visible cracks, just the natural adjustments that life demands of those who decide to walk together. However, inside Laura there was a turmoil she couldn't yet name. It wasn't a lack of love, nor was it obvious unhappiness. It was something more subtle, almost imperceptible, like a slowly growing restlessness that even she couldn't clearly explain. The new friendships, the invitations to events, the opening nights, the discussion groups on art and society began to fill spaces that had previously been just hers and Daniel's. She felt herself expanding, rediscovering herself, seeing the world through different eyes. And, without realizing it, she began to let go of the small gestures, the long conversations, the lazy afternoons with him. Daniel noticed. Not with jealousy or distrust, but with a kind of quiet sadness. He saw Laura distancing herself in small ways, in the way she took longer to respond to his messages, the way she checked her phone more frequently, her increasingly prolonged absences on weekends. He tried to understand, tried to embrace her, but little by little, he felt that the woman he shared his life with was becoming a distant version of the Laura he'd fallen in love with. Still, he remained careful. He made coffee when she slept in, left flowers on the table even when he didn't receive a "thank you" with the same tenderness as before. He told her he loved her, even when her responses came in a colder tone. And even with all this, there were no fights, shouting, or accusations between them. The house remained tidy, dinners happened, they still watched movies together on Sundays. It was as if the love was still there, but moving in opposite directions. A silent love, suffocated by everything that was left unsaid. Their relationship continued, not because there was an obligation, but because there was still hope that this phase would pass, that their love would survive the fatigue, the emotional distance, the hurried days. And so it was, between restrained gestures and spare words, that the two remained side by side. He, believing it was all a phase. She, trying to understand what had changed within herself. And neither of them knew that, by not naming what they felt, they were letting the story slip through the cracks of everyday life. And in the midst of all this, one detail, one gesture, one simple look, could change everything. But which one? And when? And what would happen when silence was no longer enough to hide what was truly coming? Laura started coming home later. At first, it was only once or twice a week. She said it was for meetings with outside professors, meetings with students for dissertation guidance, or technical visits for the event she was coordinating. Daniel was never the type to question schedules or create friction over minor absences. He trusted her with the calmness of someone who's built a life based on loyalty. When she arrived, he was still awake. He'd prepare a light supper, pour her favorite wine, and ask how her day was. And even when her answer came quickly and vaguely, he'd smile, simply happy to have her back home. There were nights when she'd come straight into the bedroom, saying she was exhausted, and he'd respect that, turning off the living room lights with a soft sigh that only the silence of the house could hear. The messages that were once filled with affection became short and pointed. I'm going to be late, I had lunch with the people from my course, I need to finish a project with a guest curator. Daniel read each one with a subtle twinge of discomfort, but he suppressed any suspicion with logical reason. She was a professional woman, dedicated, involved in what she did. It wouldn't be fair to interpret these changes as something more than they were. He thought about it repeatedly, trying to convince himself that mature love required patience, understanding, not paranoia. However, as the weeks passed, the signs became hard to ignore. The new clothes he hadn't seen her buy, the different perfumes left in the bathroom, the louder laughter on the phone, the quickly read notifications, and the unfamiliar names that appeared in his call logs. The change wasn't just in her behavior, but in the way she looked at him. There was no longer curiosity in her eyes when he talked about his projects or the books he was reading. Sometimes it seemed like she wasn't even really listening to him. And when he touched her arm mid-conversation, she subtly pulled away, as if the gesture had lost its meaning. Small deaths of intimacy that silently accumulated, one after another, like stones gradually placed on his chest. Daniel began to notice that his attempts at rapprochement were met with a kind of forced politeness. Laura would smile, thank him, but quickly return to her cell phone, to the event spreadsheets, to the emails that always seemed urgent. On nights when he prepared dinner, she would say she wasn't hungry. On mornings when he woke up early to drive her to the university, she had already left. Still, he persisted. He bought her favorite cookies, wrote notes on napkins, suggested a short trip during the next holiday, a getaway just for the two of them, as they had done in the beginning. But the response was always delayed, with empty promises that, after the event, things would go back to normal. It was a random Saturday when Daniel decided to stop by the university to surprise her with a snack she loved. He prepared everything in silence, even choosing a flower from the garden she had planted herself and placing it inside the cooler bag. He didn't announce it, he wanted it to be a spontaneous gesture, one of those surprises that, as she herself had said in the past, warmed the heart on a busy day. He parked across the street and got out excitedly, but as he approached the main lobby, he noticed that the activity was unusual for a Saturday afternoon. Most of the classrooms were closed, and there was no sign of activity at the event she was coordinating. He walked to the hallway where the art studio was. As he turned the corner, he saw the glass door ajar in the distance, with low voices and soft music playing. He recognized Laura's voice, low, almost laughing, followed by an unfamiliar male laugh. He approached with slow steps, almost as if his body knew something was wrong before his mind. He stopped in front of the door and, without making a sound, peered through the crack. There, among brushes and canvases, she sat on the wooden table they used to hold materials. Across from her, a man younger than her, casual in appearance, dark clothes, paint-covered hands, and an easy smile, lightly touched her leg as he said something that made her laugh in a way Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. It was a free, delighted, almost adolescent laugh. Laura touched his face familiarly, and for a few seconds, it was clear to Daniel that this wasn't the kind of contact that existed between coworkers. He felt the blood drain from his face. Time seemed to slow down. The snack fell from his hand without him noticing, scattering the cookies on the floor like crumbs of naive hope. He didn't get in. He didn't scream. He simply turned and walked back to the car with hurried steps, as if fleeing the scene were the only way to preserve what little remained inside him. He got in the car, started the engine, and stood there, staring at the steering wheel. The flower he had chosen fell from the passenger seat. He picked it up, stared at it for a few seconds, and then set it on the dashboard. That night, Laura arrived home as if nothing had happened. She kissed him on the cheek, told him she'd had a productive day and was exhausted. She went straight to the shower. Daniel simply nodded, poured himself a glass of wine, and sat at the table without touching his food. He watched the light reflect off the wood, trying to understand when he'd lost the woman he loved. During the shower, Laura sang softly. And it sounded, to him, like cruel irony. As if the world hadn't ended that afternoon. In the days that followed, he said nothing. He didn't confront her, didn't change his tone, didn't leave any traces of his knowledge. He began to observe her with a new, painful kind of attention. Her every gesture was now analyzed, interpreted, digested in silence. And, over time, the certainty transformed into something more devastating, the realization that the woman he'd known was no longer there. Her body was the same. Her voice, her habits, her gestures seemed familiar. But her gaze no longer sought him. Not truly. It was then, on an impulse he couldn't explain, that he decided to follow her. A part of him still wanted to be wrong, wanted to discover that it was all a misunderstanding, that moment in the studio had been just a moment of artistic intimacy, misinterpreted. He got in his car and followed her at a distance, always keeping a safe distance. He watched as she parked in front of an elegant restaurant downtown. She got out lightly, fixed her hair, and smiled at someone already waiting for her outside. It was the same man from the studio. They entered together, unhurriedly, like two lovers who had experienced this scene before. Daniel parked further ahead and got out. He walked toward the restaurant with firm steps, breathing deeply to maintain control. He stopped at the entrance and looked through the window. She was there, sitting across from him, smiling as she had in the early years of their marriage. He was touching her hand across the table. It was intimate, it was clear, it was real. Then he walked in. And it was at that moment, exactly at that instant, that her eyes met his. And she froze. The expression on her face changed in a second, as if the world had stopped. The other man turned, confused, but Daniel didn't look at him. He stopped in front of the table, stared at the woman with a calmness that hurt more than any scream, and said what he needed to say. And everything she could have explained, invented, or denied no longer mattered. Because the betrayal was no longer a shadow. It was now a garment, irreversible, wide open between them. But what Laura didn't know, was that this was only the beginning of what she was about to lose. Because there was something that hadn't yet surfaced. And when it did, it would change everything. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the living room sofa, with the lights off, listening to the distant ticking of the kitchen clock. The house seemed even quieter than it had been on other days, as if even the walls knew something had broken. Laura arrived around 11. The keys jingled in the doorknob, and her footsteps echoed softly down the hallway. When she turned on the living room light and saw him there, motionless, his eyes fixed in the darkness, she stopped for a moment. The weight of the silence was cut by his voice, firm and straightforward. "I know everything. No need to try to explain." She hesitated for a few seconds, let her bag fall to the floor, her coat slip from her shoulders, and walked slowly to the armchair across from him. She sat with her hands clasped, her eyes downcast. Tension filled the air, but she tried. She said she was confused, that she didn't know how things had gotten to that point, that the other person was just a distraction, an escape from the pressure, the expectations, the internal demands that she could no longer bear. Daniel didn't interrupt her. He just listened. But as she spoke, something inside him drew away, retreated from the scene with a serenity that surprised even himself. When she finished, she apologized. She said she didn't want to lose him, that she still loved him, that she had no idea how much all of this would destroy her too. But he didn't react with anger, nor did he yell or cry. He simply said he needed some time, that he was going to leave the house, and that she should use this space to think too. When he got up and started up the stairs, she ran to him, grabbed his arm, and told him she didn't want him to go. But he gently pulled away and went upstairs without looking back. In the following weeks, he rented a small apartment. Quiet, functional, practical. He returned to work more intensely, filling in the gaps with spreadsheets and reports. He declined calls, ignored messages, and didn't respond to her emails. Only when he felt strong enough to face everything head-on did he agree to meet her at a cafe. They sat face to face, without touching, without promises. She looked fragile, thinner, with deep circles under her eyes and an anxiety that escaped with every movement of her hands. She said she was in therapy, that she had ended her previous relationship, that she understood the reasons for her own escape. She said the love still existed, that she wanted to try again, that she knew he was the man for her life. But he, with a calm that wasn't coldness, replied that he understood her regret, but that he no longer felt the same desire to build something with her. That there were things that, even forgiven, could not be forgotten. Laura cried right there, under the discreet gazes of the other tables. She begged for another chance, saying he was her home, that no one understood her like he did. But he wouldn't give in. He said he needed to move on, that he deserved to live without fear, without doubts, without open wounds. She tried to say it was just a mistake, that he could have made mistakes too, that no one is perfect. And it was at that moment that Daniel finally looked up and let the silence transform into something deeper, heavier. Then he told her. He told her about the last few weeks. About how, after the separation, he'd reconnected with people who had drifted apart over time. One of them, in particular, had unexpectedly resurfaced, Helena. An old college friend, who had been his confidant during his early youth. There had never been anything between them but friendship. But now, after so long, their reunion was different. She, too, had gone through a difficult divorce, also had scars hidden beneath her skin. They began talking frequently, exchanging messages, sharing silences. It wasn't an instant passion, but a delicate, serene, real development. Laura stared at him with red eyes, clenching her fists under the table. She wanted to know if he loved her. He replied that he didn't yet know the name of what he felt, but he knew that, with Helena by his side, he could breathe. He wasn't afraid of being insufficient. He didn't have to constantly prove himself. And then she asked, her voice breaking, if he'd slept with her. He hesitated for a few seconds and then replied yes. That it was recent, but it was true. That it didn't happen out of need, but out of connection. And that, for the first time in months, he felt seen again. The silence that followed was brutal. Laura leaned back in her chair, as if needing physical support to keep from collapsing. She murmured that it was unfair, that he couldn't have moved on so quickly, that she was still trying to save what they had. But he responded firmly. He said he tried to save her for a long time, alone. That he'd reached out for months, while she'd already let go. That forgiving didn't mean going back. And that now, finally, he understood what it was like to love someone and be loved in return. She tried to get up, but couldn't. She stood there, tears in her eyes, unsure of how to proceed. She said she would regret it for the rest of her life. That she would give anything to go back. But he just took a deep breath and said he hoped, with all his heart, that she found peace. Because he had already found his. That same week, Laura tried to get back into her routine. She returned to her classes, her projects, her friends. But everything felt empty. The coffees that once brought her pleasure now tasted bitter. The nights seemed too long. She tried to distract herself with conversations, outings, new faces. But none of them made her laugh the way he did. None of them understood her silences the way he did. She began to miss even the moments she had previously considered mundane, the way he made the bed, the smell of coffee in the morning, the way he looked at her without saying anything. And the more time passed, the more I felt the weight of what I had lost. I tried to reconnect with him once more, writing a long, heartfelt letter, saying I finally understood. But no response came. Days later, I saw a photo on social media of Daniel and Helena in a coffee shop, smiling and holding hands. The caption read, "Now, yes, I know what likeness is." It was like a punch in the gut. And in that moment, regret stopped being a theory and became a daily presence. Because from that moment on, she knew he had moved on. Not with resentment, not with hurt. but with clarity. And that she would never be what she had been to him again. Nor he to her. The secret that had been gnawing at her insides now crushed her outsides. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of possibility. Because those who betray true love can even be forgiven. But you won't always be invited to stay. And when she saw Daniel smiling at another woman the way he'd once smiled at her, she knew that was the true punishment. Not contempt. But indifference. And no scream, no tear, no plea for forgiveness could redeem what she herself had chosen to bury. Laura took a while to leave the cafe that day. Sitting at the same table where she'd heard the man she loved had already started over, she remained motionless for minutes that felt like an eternity. The waiter approached her twice to ask if she wanted anything, but she just nodded, staring at her empty wine glass as if waiting for time to rewrite it. Daniel's face, serene, distant, replayed in her mind like a cruel memory, not because there was anger in him, but because there was nothing left. The absence of pain in his eyes hurt more than any scream. Leaving the cafe, she walked aimlessly through streets that seemed to have lost their color. The shop windows, the hustle and bustle of the sidewalks, the sound of cars, everything seemed faded. He got into the car and drove, unsure of where, his fingers trembling on the steering wheel and his breath caught in his chest. When he realized it, he was in front of the house where they'd lived together. The same bright facade, the same plants in the entrance, but something had changed. The porch light was on, a new curtain fluttered in the wind, and for a few seconds, he had the illusion that everything was as it had been. But he only had to look closer to see the outline of a female figure through the window, laughing at something he couldn't hear. It was her. Helena. She wanted to get out. She wanted to knock on the door, tell him it was hers, that the house was still her story, her memory, her promise. But she didn't. She stood there, her hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel, her eyes filled with tears, until Daniel's figure appeared at the window, bringing his wife a cup of tea. They smiled, exchanged a calm glance, and the curtain closed. The pain she felt wasn't jealousy, but real loss. Not because he was with someone else, but because he had become someone she no longer had access to. He was no longer hers. And she knew, with a painful certainty, that he never would be again. In the following days, he tried to immerse himself in his own commitments. He returned to classes, took on extra projects, went out with colleagues. But nothing filled the hole growing inside him. He tried to laugh in conversations, feign enthusiasm in meetings, but when he got home, everything fell apart. The apartment he was in now felt cold, as if refusing to welcome him. Every corner screamed the emptiness that had once been filled by him. He began having trouble sleeping, and in the wee hours of the morning, he would review old messages, photos, videos. Sometimes I would write long texts to him and delete them before sending them. Other times, I would reread the old ones and cry. He began to see their routine with new eyes, reliving small moments and realizing the subtlety with which he loved her. And how she, in her restlessness, failed to see it. One gray Sunday afternoon, while sorting through old boxes that had been left with her after the separation, she found Daniel's notebook. Inside were drafts of thoughts, plans, and random sentences he'd written when he wanted to clear his head. Tucked between pages was a text he'd never sent. A kind of letter he'd written in the days before he left home. The words were harsh, but full of love. He talked about how he tried, how invisible he felt, how each failed attempt at connection was like a silent nail in the coffin of their relationship. He said he never wanted to be the man who left, but that the time had come when staying hurt more. And he concluded by saying that, even though he'd left, he still wanted her to be happy, even if it wasn't with him. Laura read and reread that letter dozens of times. She cried until she couldn't cry anymore. And that very day, for the first time, she acknowledged out loud, "I destroyed the man who loved me most in life, there was no one else to blame." It wasn't the other person, it wasn't the routine, it wasn't life. It was her. She was the one who ignored the signs, who dismissed the gestures, who bet on a fleeting illusion without thinking about what she was losing. And worst of all, now, even though I understood everything, there was nothing I could do to recover. Weeks later, she learned from a mutual friend that Daniel was planning a long trip with Helena. They were going to the south of the country to find a house surrounded by nature, where they intended to live together for a while. The news tore her apart. She tried to convince herself that it was better this way, that he deserved to be happy, but her heart insisted on screaming that she still loved him. So she decided to seek him out one last time. Not to ask to come back, but to tell him what she needed to. To avoid carrying the weight of everything that had been kept quiet. She waited for him in front of the building where she knew he still worked. When she saw him leave, her heart raced. Daniel looked different. Lighter, unshaven, and with a more serene expression. When he saw her, he stopped for a second. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. He walked up to her calmly and said her name gently, but without enthusiasm. She asked for a few minutes, and he agreed. They walked to a bench in the small park next to the building. She began by saying she didn't want to disrupt his life, that she wasn't expecting anything, but that she needed to talk. She told him how she regretted it, how everything now felt empty, how each day away from him was a reminder of what she'd lost. She said she'd understood, belatedly, the value of everything he offered. And that if she could, she would go back in time. Not to undo what she'd done, but to do it differently. Daniel listened silently. When she finished, he took a deep breath and said he was glad she'd found this clarity. He knew the process would be painful, but necessary. And that he, too, was deeply sorry for everything they'd been through. But now, he was a different man. And he could no longer be what she needed. Laura smiled sadly. She said she understood. That she would always remember him as the most honest love of her life. And she asked only one thing, that he be happy. That he not let what she did erase the beautiful way he loved her. He held her hand for a few seconds, squeezed lightly, and stood. He said he hoped that one day she, too, would find her peace again. And, without looking back, he left. She stood there, staring lost among the trees, feeling the wind brush against her face. There was no more anger, no more despair. Just a deep emptiness. The kind of emptiness that can't be filled with time or distractions, but that one learns to carry. The kind of pain that brutally teaches the price of neglecting true love. Days later, she saw a new photo on social media, Daniel and Helena, in front of a house in the countryside, smiling with the caption, "Beginnings deserve peace." She didn't cry. She simply put away her phone and walked to the window, looking at the afternoon sky. Outside, life went on. And inside her, something was breaking and rebuilding at the same time. Because sometimes, the real punishment isn't being hated. It's being forgotten. It's knowing you were loved with everything, and still losing. Not by chance. But by choice. And that choice was hers. Laura began to live in a state of suspension. The days didn't progress, they just repeated themselves. She woke up and did the bare minimum to keep up appearances. She got dressed, showed up for work, answered emails, tutored students, attended meetings, but it was as if everything was happening outside of her. The emptiness growing inside her took on different forms, deep insomnia, lack of appetite, a lack of enthusiasm for everything that once thrilled her. She stopped painting, put aside side projects, avoided events, and when she did show up, it was only to avoid explanations. The apartment became a reflection of how she felt, silent, too dark during the day, subtly messy, as if she didn't even have the energy to reorganize the chaos. She started talking to a therapist recommended by a colleague, and in the first few sessions, she could barely form coherent sentences. But over time, she began to unravel the thread of her own regret, and little by little she understood that her pain was not just the loss of Daniel, but the awareness of what she was capable of doing to someone who only knew how to love her. The most painful memories weren't the breakup, nor even the image of him with another woman. They were the small gestures he made, now seen through the lens of absence. The way he sat beside her while she painted, just watching, silently. The simple good morning messages with boring emojis, which once seemed automatic, were now missed. The conversations about movies he tried to enjoy simply because she loved them. The way he listened without interrupting, even when the subject matter didn't interest him. These were the memories that hurt. Not the big ones, but the small ones. The ones that build true intimacy and are only realized when they're gone. The ones that are hard to find again. A few months passed since that last encounter with Daniel. She didn't try to reach out to him again, respecting his decision and perhaps recognizing that any attempt would simply be another form of disrespect. She began to look within herself more honestly. And, for the first time in a long time, she stopped victimizing herself. She understood that her impulses, her insecurities, her constant search for novelty, didn't justify her choice to cheat. She began writing about it in a journal, not to forgive herself, but to understand. The process was painful, but necessary. As she revisited her own mistakes, she realized that her greatest failure wasn't loving someone else. It was failing to cultivate the love she already had. It was normalizing the other's presence to the point of no longer seeing him. It was failing to realize that Daniel also needed to be loved with enthusiasm, attention, and depth. On the other side of the story, Daniel was experiencing something completely different. His routine had changed significantly. The new, more secluded home offered a tranquility he hadn't known he needed until he experienced it. Helena was different from Laura in almost every way. She had a slower pace, was attentive to details, and showed affection with gestures that seemed small but were intense. She demanded nothing from him beyond what he was. And this, after so long trying to be more for someone who always seemed distant, was liberating. With her, he didn't need to prove himself. He could simply exist. The two began to share simple moments with genuine pleasure. Walks at dawn, readings by the fire, long lunches without having to talk constantly. And little by little, without realizing it, Daniel began to rebuild himself from the inside out. Still, there was a wound inside him that took time to heal. Neither Helena's presence, nor the new scenery, nor the recent smiles could completely erase the weight of what she'd experienced. Some nights, he remembered details with a dull pang of pain. Not for Laura's absence, but for what she'd chosen to do. For the lies, the absences, the words thrown carelessly when he was trying hardest to stay afloat. These were the memories that still visited him from time to time, like silent ghosts asking to be heard one last time before they depart. But he no longer clung to them. He let them come, hurt, and then leave. Laura, on her solitary journey, began to face a new reality, external judgments. Friends who had previously been close were now more distant. Some knew what had happened, others only suspected, but the treatment had changed. And this, though subtle, was profound. She realized that when you betray a true love, you don't just lose the loved one. You lose the gaze of others, the respect of those who believed in the couple, the silent admiration that builds over the years. She became, in the eyes of many, the woman who lost the right man because of a foolish mistake. And this label weighed more heavily than she could admit out loud. It was on a Saturday morning that she made an unexpected decision. She decided to visit the house where she had lived with Daniel. Not with the intention of seeing him, but simply to face, one last time, everything she had built and destroyed. She walked slowly down the street, her heart heavy, her hands cold. As she approached, she saw a local produce market being set up in the park across the street. Children ran among the stalls, couples held hands, and there was a serenity in the air that contrasted with the weight she carried inside her chest. She stopped across the street, simply observing. The house had its windows open, a few new plants decorated the garden, and a bicycle leaned against the gate. What had once been familiar now seemed to belong to another life. As he watched, he saw Helena leave with a shopping basket in her hands. She was smiling, talking to a neighbor. A few seconds later, Daniel appeared, locking the gate with a key. He looked at Helena with visible affection, put his hand on her back, and the two crossed the street toward the market. Laura hid discreetly behind a car, watching. It wasn't envy, nor was it hatred. It was a new feeling. Something between resignation and melancholy. She finally understood what he had built there. And she knew, with all the clarity in the world, that there was no longer room for her in that narrative. The time they once had was over. And now, all that remained was the silence of choices. When he returned home that day, he sat at the table and opened the notebook where he'd been writing. For the first time, she wrote a letter to herself. Not to Daniel, nor to apologize. A letter where she admitted her failure without seeking justification. Where she acknowledged the love she'd received but failed to appreciate. And where she promised herself that, from then on, she would not repeat the mistake of ignoring what was true. It was a commitment to her own dignity, to the woman she could still become, even after everything. That night, as he looked up at the sky from the balcony, he felt something different. It wasn't relief, nor was it peace. But perhaps, the beginning of a healing process. Because, by facing what he had done and its consequences without denying it, he began to free himself from the prison of paralyzing regret. He understood that carrying guilt is necessary, but not eternal. And that the true punishment for betrayal isn't being punished by others, but living with the knowledge of how much he hurt someone he only wanted to love. It was too late to go back, but perhaps not too late to be different. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued at a serene pace. He continued with his projects, his books, his sunset walks with Helena. From time to time, he still remembered Laura, but without the pain. Just as one remembers something that once hurt, but now no longer does. He had overcome it. Not because he wanted to erase the past, but because he chose to move on. And moving on, he now knew, was a daily choice. And the most liberating choice was to love lightly. He had suffered, yes, but now he was living. And living fully was his most beautiful way of starting over. Over the next few months, life moved on for both of them, but in completely different ways. Laura sank into a kind of functional, automated routine that left no room for overthinking. It was her form of emotional survival. She began waking earlier, not out of necessity, but because she could no longer fully rest. The nights remained short, filled with thoughts, and even when her body begged for rest, her mind insisted on revisiting moments that could no longer be rewritten. She insisted on revisiting Daniel's face in every silent goodbye he'd said before even walking out the door, in the details she could only now see, in the long pauses between sentences, in the sad eyes she pretended not to notice, in the small kindnesses she treated as an obligation. One by one, these memories imposed themselves with cruel clarity, like a kind of silent justice meted out by her own conscience. And there was nowhere to escape. The mirrors stared back at her with the same coldness she had once directed at him, and now, in the solitude of her own mistakes, it was as if she had finally lost the permission to ignore herself. It was on a Thursday afternoon that he received an unexpected call. One of the students she had mentored years before was organizing a seminar on ethics in human relations and wanted to invite her to speak. At first, he declined. He felt he had no moral standing to even talk about art, let alone ethics. But the student insisted, reminding her of how inspiring she had been during her training. The invitation disconcerted her. It was as if someone still saw something valuable in her. It disturbed her as much as it moved her. After days of reflection, he accepted. Not out of vanity, but because he believed that perhaps the most honest way to move forward was to use his experience to prevent others from making the same mistake. On the day of the event, she arrived early. She watched the young people organizing the equipment, adjusting lights, testing microphones. She felt out of place, as if she had invaded a reality she was no longer a part of. When her name was announced, she took the stage with measured steps. She took a deep breath and, before an attentive audience, didn't read any previously written text. Her voice trembled at first, but it gained strength as she delved into her own truths. She didn't mention names, but she spoke about inattention, about the poison of the ego when fed in silence, about the danger of believing that love will always wait. She said that sometimes one betrays oneself long before someone else exists. One betrays oneself in the words left unsaid, in the averted glances, in the absence of presence. And that, when one realizes it, love has already departed, even if the body is still there. The audience fell silent at the end. There was applause, yes, but what really struck her was the look on the face of a young woman in the front row, who was crying silently, as if she'd seen herself in that mirror. Laura stepped off the stage feeling, for the first time in a long time, that she'd done something that mattered. Meanwhile, Daniel was experiencing a serene and productive phase. The new house with Helena was more than a home, it was a reconstruction of everything he believed he'd lost. For the first time, he engaged in activities he'd previously ignored. He planted, cooked, and wrote. She found the courage to join a book club and began organizing literary gatherings at local cafes. Helena, who always encouraged him with gentleness and openness, was the kind of partner who didn't try to mold him, but inspired him to grow. And this, after years of feeling like he had to work hard to be seen, was like learning to breathe again. The two lived a relationship based on balance, calm affection, and mutual trust. There was no rush, no pressure. They were two adults with difficult histories, but willing not to let trauma dictate their next steps. On one of those quiet afternoons, Daniel received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just her handwritten name. Upon opening it, he found a letter written by Laura. The handwriting was familiar, but the tone was different. There was no drama, no pleading. It was a letter from someone who had finally understood herself. She spoke maturely about regret, about how she had grasped the inner workings that led her to destroy what was most good for her. She said she didn't expect a response, that she wasn't seeking reconciliation. She simply wanted him to know that his love had been the most beautiful thing she had ever received. And that, because of that, she now strived every day to become someone who wouldn't embarrass him, even if he never saw her again. Daniel read in silence. The words didn't strike him like a blow, but like a distant echo of a story long gone. He felt respect for the letter's honesty. And, deep down, relief. Because now he knew, with certainty, that there was nothing holding him back. That the freedom he felt with Helena wasn't an escape. It was a new beginning. He put the letter away in a drawer and didn't tell anyone. Months passed, and time, as always, managed to transform even the deepest pain into bearable scars. Laura continued her process of rebuilding. She picked up her paintbrushes again, opened a small studio where she offered art workshops and emotional listening. She created a space where people could create and, at the same time, talk about their pain, their grief, their new beginnings. She became known in the community as someone who didn't judge. She was sought out by young people in crisis, by couples, by people carrying difficult regrets. And, in a way, there, she found purpose. She knew her story would always be a shadow, but she decided to use that shadow to generate light where she could. She no longer carried the weight of guilt with the same desperation. She had learned to live with it, to embrace it as part of who she was. Because accepting one's own flaws is also a way to become better. One night, while tidying up the studio after a workshop, she received an unexpected visit from a young woman. She was the daughter of a couple who had recently separated due to betrayal. The girl said she felt destroyed, that she hated her father, and that she couldn't forgive him. Laura listened calmly, without interrupting. Then she shared part of her own story. Not in detail, but enough for the girl to understand that sometimes, those who hurt also suffer. And that forgiveness isn't a gift to the other, but a relief for herself. The girl cried, thanked her, and said that perhaps now she could sleep peacefully. Laura closed the studio that night feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, lightness. For the first time, not because she had forgotten, but because she had transformed. Across town, Daniel continued to live life to the fullest. Helena had become part of the family, gradually integrating into the relationships he cherished. People noticed how much happier, more energetic, and more at peace he was. And although he didn't talk much about the past, he didn't hide how much he had learned from everything he'd experienced. Pain had taught him to be more present, more direct, more attentive to the little things. Not because he was afraid of losing someone again, but because he knew that true love only blossoms with constant care. One morning, while walking with Helena through a craft fair, he stopped in front of a painting displayed at one of the stalls. It was an abstract painting, with intense lines and bold colors, which somehow seemed familiar. As he approached, he saw a small plaque with the artist's name, Laura. Helena noticed his distant look and asked if he wanted to talk. Daniel just smiled, nodded, and said everything was fine. He bought the painting, not as a souvenir, but as recognition. Because he knew that, despite everything, that woman had tried to heal. And that, for him, was enough. They returned home in silence. That night, he hung the canvas in his office. It wasn't about her. It was about what he had overcome. About the capacity for rebuilding that everyone carries, even after what seems unforgivable. It was a symbol that pain can be transformed, as long as one chooses not to cling to it as an identity. That same week, Laura was invited to participate in a documentary about forgiveness and new beginnings. She accepted with trepidation, but felt the time had come to tell her story more broadly. And, when giving her testimony, she said something that stuck in the minds of those watching, that sometimes, the worst thing isn't being betrayed, it's realizing that you were the one who betrayed, and that you missed the best things in life because you didn't see it in time. She said that the true punishment for betrayal isn't judgment, but awareness. And that, if she could leave one message, it would be this: don't wait until you lose to appreciate something. Because sometimes, when you wake up, it's already too late. And there, in front of the cameras, without forced tears, without trying to be emotional, she showed the kind of repentance that doesn't seek applause. Just peace. And finally, she began to find it. It was on a warm October afternoon that everything seemed to finally settle down. Time, with its insistent gentleness, had done the work that no direct attempt could complete. Life had followed its own course, without asking permission, without waiting for regrets or laments. Daniel walked along the dirt road beside his new home, the reddish sky reflecting the serenity he finally carried within. Helena followed close behind, gathering dried branches and wildflowers to decorate the living room. They had moved permanently to the countryside a few months earlier, a silent and mature decision, one of someone who no longer needed confirmation to live their feelings. There was no more rush, no more open scars, no more ancient voices whispering doubts. There was presence. There was truth. And, above all, there was peace. Meanwhile, Laura was finishing organizing her latest exhibition. It was her first solo show in a major cultural center, and the invitation came after the success of the documentary she participated in. The response was astonishing. People of all ages wrote to her, sharing their stories, their pain, their own regrets. And there, amidst that stream of anonymous confessions, she realized something profound: her story wasn't unique, and perhaps, for that very reason, it had so much to say. The paintings in the exhibition spoke of ruptures, but also of reconstruction. They weren't aesthetically bland. They were intense, dense, visceral. How she had become. They didn't try to please, but invited reflection. And, during her opening speech, she made a point of saying that the exhibition wasn't about art in the traditional sense. It was about exposing what many hide. It was about giving a face to the pain we cause and the pain we feel. And that, above all, it was about responsibility. The responsibility to love with care. To be present. Of not neglecting true love in the name of momentary adventures that later cost too much. In the audience, among the many attentive faces, stood an unexpected figure, Helena. She had come alone, of her own free will, driven by sincere curiosity, but also by a feeling difficult to name. It hadn't been easy for her to accept Daniel's past. But throughout their relationship, he understood that maturity also means knowing that everyone has stories, and that what matters is what you choose to build after them. At the end of the event, Laura saw her among the visitors and hesitated for a moment. But then she decided to walk up to her. The two greeted each other with a calm look. There was no animosity, no rivalry. There was something rarer, recognition. Helena complimented the paintings, and Laura thanked her with a sincere smile. After a few seconds of silence, Laura simply said, "Take care of him." And Helena replied, "He already takes good care of himself, but I do." Then the two went their separate ways. And that brief encounter was, perhaps, the most symbolic of all. Because there were no winners or losers. There were two women who, despite everything, chose not to harbor hatred. And that choice was greater than any dispute. In the following months, Daniel and Helena took a decisive step. They opened a small artistic guesthouse in the house where they lived. A welcoming space with themed rooms, painting and writing workshops, and intimate cooking. They welcomed people from all over the country, and each visitor took away a piece of the light-hearted energy they cultivated together. Daniel had returned to writing. He published a book of chronicles called Things I Learned When I Left, and it was an immediate success. It wasn't a tale of pain, but a testimony of overcoming. The words resonated deeply because they came not from a place of resentment, but from understanding. From someone who had been destroyed and chose to rebuild, even in fear. Laura, in turn, was invited to coordinate a project with women in situations of emotional vulnerability. The proposal was to use art as a tool for healing and transformation. She accepted without hesitation. There, amidst the hardest stories she had ever heard, she found purpose. And although she continued to live alone, for the first time she felt that loneliness wasn't punishment. It was space. Space to breathe, to start over, to accept herself. And, most importantly, to not repeat it. One morning, when Laura opened her studio email, she found an unexpected message. It was from Daniel. Short, to the point, but deeply respectful. He said he had read about her project and wanted to congratulate her. That he admired her journey, that he was rooting for her, and that he truly hoped she was at peace. There was nothing more. No extra commas, no ellipses. It was a message from someone who no longer carried any hurt. And, upon reading it, Laura cried. She cried like she hadn't cried in months. Not because she wanted to get back together, or because she still hoped for something. But because, in that moment, she knew she had been forgiven. And there is no greater relief than that. Knowing that, even after hurting someone deeply, they moved on without carrying you as their wound. Years later, everyone's lives had settled down. Daniel and Helena were married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends and nature. A wedding without excess, but full of meaning. At the end of the ceremony, Daniel made a toast, and among his words, he said that true love is the one that begins when we learn to respect the other's pain without trying to fix it. That he had learned this the hard way, but also the most liberating. In the audience, everyone applauded, moved. And that afternoon, at sunset, he slow danced with Helena, as if nothing more needed to be said. Laura, for her part, continued writing, painting, and helping people. She rejected new relationships for a long time, not out of fear, but out of respect for her own process. Years later, she met someone. A sensitive, patient, widowed photographer who didn't idealize her, but welcomed her. And although it took time for her to allow herself to be loved again, she eventually surrendered to this new form of love, more mature, more conscious, more peaceful. And, for the first time, she loved responsibly. This story shows us that forgiveness doesn't always bring reunion. That some losses are permanent. That betraying someone who loves us deeply isn't just a mistake, it's a breach of trust that may never be rebuilt. But it also shows that it's possible to reinvent yourself, even after making mistakes. That it's possible to learn, even after destroying something valuable. And that, although time can't be reversed, it can teach, as long as you're willing to listen. Comment below with your thoughts on this story. Do you think Laura deserved a second chance? Did Daniel do the right thing by moving on with Helena? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, and don't miss the next episodes, they're even more intense. And remember, on this channel, we never support any kind of betrayal, all stories are fictional and constructed to show that cheating is not just an impulsive act, it is a choice that destroys families, destroys trust, and often destroys true love. Let this story serve as a warning. Because losing someone who truly loves you is a pain that, often, there's no turning back. And the price, almost always, is too high.